All right. Hello, everybody. We are going to get this started. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My name is Claire. I'm A3's Membership Services Coordinator. We had over 200 registrations for this webinar. We are very stoked to see the interest. Interest in this event. Probably see a few more folks trickle in as we get started here. So this is our second webinar of the season, the first one being the Forecasting Stress and Resilience panel. If you missed that one, you can log into your member account and find that recording underneath events. So now I just want to thank our sponsors for making all this possible. Tonight we have a special thanks for Irwin Guide. So thank you to all these excellent folks for their support. And now I'm going to hand the mic over to A3 Board Vice President Eric Peich to introduce our guest this evening. So Eric, go ahead and take it away, please.
Thanks, Claire. I have the pleasure of introducing Art Mears and Chris Wilbur. Of course, they need no introduction, but very briefly, Art and Chris started working together in 2006. Art has been an Avalanche consultant on over 1,000 projects in 9 states and 8 countries and has published dozens of technical and research papers. Chris has applied his background in geotechnical engineering and fluid mechanics to analyze and understand natural hazard processes for clients throughout the Mountain West since 1995. So together they have something like 7,000 years of experience in the avalanche industry. I'm going to turn it over to Chris and he's going to start the show.
Thanks, Eric. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Yeah, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Art, and I don't know if you can see me. Do we need to turn on a light?
Yeah, I think turn a light on.
Yeah, the sun just went down here in Utah. Anyway, as Eric said, Art doesn't really need an introduction, but I wanted to say a couple of words about him. We think of when we think of pioneers in the avalanche field, we think of Atwater and Perla and La Chapelle, but I would argue that Art Mears is in there in a slightly different role. When he started in this business, there was no internet, there was no Google Earth. You had to go to the library to get stuff, and a lot of it was in foreign languages. And so what he did, he paved the way for people like me and others to follow in his footsteps. And so with that, I just want to say I'm so proud to introduce him and say he's been my mentor and friend for ever since 2006. So here's our years.
Hi, everybody. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Well, I think we'll go to screen sharing now. Go ahead and hit screen sharing. And then they won't have to look at us.
Okay. So I guess we can start with the presentation, and I appreciate everyone coming, and especially on Super Tuesday night. It's a great night to be out here and doing our own thing and not worrying about all the politics. We have a PowerPoint presentation on avalanche zoning and the history of avalanche zoning in the United States in particular. Our introductory slide is a good, interesting one too. And Janie picked that one for us. We didn't pick it, but it's a slide that came down in a big avalanche period in February 1986 in Inyo County, California, up in one of the canyons of the eastern Sierra Nevada. And this particular picture shows the tremendous variation in flow directions of big wet slide, which has to be considered, of course, in the right situation when we have avalanche zoning considerations. This is a big wet slide that came from a couple thousand vertical feet above, and it spread out. Anyway, just as an introduction.
Hey, Art, just to interrupt you, I don't believe that your slides are showing. Could you go ahead and try to share those?
They're not? Thanks for telling us.
Couldn't just leave you up there.
Uh-oh. Yeah, I wonder what happened with our Zoom.
No worries. We'll get it figured out.
We may have to log in again.
Okay.
Oh, it thinks we're in. Let us know when you can see our screen if you can.
While you're pulling that up, so we can see your screen. We can just see the your internet browser. But I wanted to let everyone know while Chris is pulling that up that we will indeed take questions at the end of the presentation. And if you feel like raising your hand and you want to ask a live question, feel free to do that. There's the raise hand button on the bottom, or you can simply just type your question in the Q&A, not the chat, but the Q&A. That'll help us keep them all in one place. So we can see your opening slide there, Chris, and thanks. Take it away.
All right, back to you, Art.
Now we can see it. This is a big slide that came down in February of 1986 in Juneau County in the eastern Sierra Nevada. And this just shows how a big wet slide can spread in almost random directions on the alluvial fan. One of the things that we do occasionally have to consider in zoning for the hazardous areas that can be affected by avalanches. But this is just an introduction. We're going to kind of go into a history of avalanche zoning, mostly in this country. But first, I want to define what's really meant by that. We've got two types of avalanche zoning, really. The first type is zoning for current danger, and we're really familiar with that because we encounter it almost on a daily basis in the avalanche forecast. We're not going to be discussing that type of avalanche zoning, the daily zoning that we see, but it is the biggest source of exposure, risk, and accidents in the country, in this country. This has not always been the case, however. Back in the turn of the 20th century, 19th to 20th century period, most of the accidents and fatalities and avalanches were in mining areas, as I'll discuss later. But we're going to be talking about the second type of zoning, which is the zoning for land use planning and engineering. And that's illustrated by this second lower slide that shows the detailed runout of the extreme or design avalanche that you consider for land use planning and engineering, an entirely different situation than the current zoning we just mentioned. The purpose of avalanche zoning really is to can I just X out of this?
I don't know if you want to close that.
Yeah, maybe not.
Part of his slide is covered on our screen.
On our screen, part of the slide is covered.
You're all good here. We can see the slides without any other boxes.
The slide, okay.
Yeah, the purpose of avalanche zoning, of course, is to prevent unnecessary losses of life and property, public and private property, and to avoid unnecessary public expenses and risks for disaster responses. And we have a couple of examples here. One from 1981 or 1971 at Yodeland near Stevens Pass, Washington, where several buildings were hit and there were fatalities in this area in 1971. And then almost 50 years later, here's this example in Ketchum, Idaho, where very large wet slides came down and produced a significant amount of property damage. And zoning would have, if the zoning had been in place in both of these places, these problems wouldn't have occurred. One of the problems we come up against is a public risk perception. And that is often irrational because people usually have a very short observation period. as opposed to the long return period required in hazard zones. And we can look down below in this table, and we can look at what we call the encounter probability for different observation periods. Suppose, for example, we have a 40-year observation period, maybe the length of a long career to ski area, or a long period of occupation in a municipality or a county. A 40-year period seems like a long time, but with even a 40-year period of observation, if we look at various return periods of avalanches, a 30-year, a 100-year return period, a 300-year return period, and a 1,000-year return period, you see that the probability that a person with 40 years of observation would even have seen a 30-year avalanche is only 74%. 100-year avalanche is only a 33% chance that a person with 40 years of observation would actually have seen a 100-year avalanche, and the probabilities continue down for the 300 and 1,000-year avalanche. And my personal opinion is that there's no really good reason to use return periods as long as 1,000 years, although it has been used in some places in Europe. When you get to long return periods like 1,000 years, you get into the time scale of climate change, and so the return period really isn't constant. It changes with the climate for these very, very long return periods. In the United States, the avalanche zoning definitions that we've normally used are based upon the Swiss avalanche zoning, which was developed after the destructive winter of 1950 or 51, where many people were killed, and we'll talk about that. And thousands of fatalities occurred in Switzerland, Austria, France, Norway, and other countries over the years before avalanche zoning was in place, not just in 50 and 51. And the zones are defined as such. A red zone or high hazard zone are all avalanches with return periods of less than 30 years and impact pressures of larger than 600 pounds. That would be a blue zone, an area where you're allowed to mitigate or possibly develop areas. And then there's a red zone, which are areas where the return period is less than 30 years, or the pressures are more than 600 pounds per square foot, or 30 kilopascals. These pressures are not design pressures. These are just zoning classifications that are used to determine what type of land use can be used in those areas. But a red zone, to define it, is an area of relatively frequent avalanches, 1 per 30 years or 3% annual probability, or an area of high or destructive impact potential. A blue zone is an area where both of these conditions of both high pressure and short return period are missing. Both of them have to be satisfied. And again, I emphasize that the pressures themselves to use to define the zones are different than design pressures. Avalanche zoning has been very effective in Europe. It's an effective type of mitigation. In the winter of 50-51, for example, 233 people were killed in Switzerland and Austria alone. But after a similar avalanche winter in 1999, far fewer people were killed in France and Austria and Switzerland, even though the population in these areas had increased substantially. That, in fact, the hazard was reduced because of extensive structural defenses and forecasting, which also contributed to reduce the losses in 1999. And when we compare the avalanche zoning in the USA versus Europe, In the United States, the exposure population center has been very short compared to in Europe. A very short history and our lesser population density has resulted in much smaller exposure and fewer deaths. The most severe exposure and serious accidents that we've encountered and deaths has been in mining activity, most of these more than 100 years ago. I'm not going to talk about all these. I'm just going to show you the list of places where avalanche zoning has been used in the United States. And you can see I won't go through them all, but starting in Vail all the way down through Cordova, Alaska, there's about 15 different locations. And Chris and I have worked in avalanche mapping and mitigation for many places that don't have avalanche zoning requirements in place. Well, now we're going to look at some of the specific examples. Barron's Avenue avalanche path, a very famous one in Juneau, Alaska. If you look at the picture here, here's the Barron's path. It comes down and you can see the development directly at the base of it. And it's really an obvious and conspicuous avalanche path. And it's probably among places in the United States, the most severe exposure of any avalanche path in the United States. In 1962, this picture here shows some of the damage that took place from the last major avalanche in the Barron's Avenue path. There has been avalanches in Barron's Avenue avalanche path since then, but they've not been as big or as damaging as the one in 1962. Now, I think it's interesting that the people there who live along Barron's Avenue, the houses there, they're aware of the avalanche. They have to be. They look right up at it all the time. But they just feel, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, they just feel that the risk from avalanches is not as significant as some of the other risks they normally take. And so they just want to live there with no mitigation. And I think it's important for everyone to recognize the fact that Alaska is the land of the free and the home of the brave. And that's what's going on. People just don't want to be told what to do. The municipality of Anchorage, of Juneau, that is extremely interested in trying to do their best to protect the people. And they've dealt with these avalanche problems in the Barron's Avenue and other places several times. It's the most studied avalanche path probably in the United States. Most studied avalanche path that they have. To give you an example of the history, this was done in 1972. Hans Fruder was working on the geophysical hazards analysis of Juneau. He mapped these avalanche paths. It was remapped again in 1992 by Doug Fesser and myself. We're working in Alaska, and we essentially said the same thing. Our maps were a little different, but not much different. It was studied just several years ago by the Swiss Federal Institute for Snow and Avalanche Research, and they recommended that several places along Barron's Avenue were completely were bought out and not used at all, but that never happened. And then it was mapped again just a couple of years ago by a Canadian consulting group, and they essentially came up with a very similar result. There's been no real disagreement as to the danger of avalanches in the Barron's Avenue path. Another example that's quite old here in the United States is Ketchum, Idaho, at the base of the Sun Valley ski area. There's a good oblique view of it here. And Norm Wilson mapped these back in 1977. red zones and blue zones. I mapped them again the next year, was hired by the town of Ketchum. And our maps were different, but they weren't too substantially different. They were both about the same. They told the same thing. I had a yellow zone, a powder blast zone, which Norm didn't use. And some of Norm's runouts were longer than mine. Some of mine were shorter than his, but they basically said the same thing. And so what the town of Ketchum has done is they require people, based on these old maps, they require people they look at the most conservative of the two maps. And that's the way they make a decision as to whether mitigation or any mitigation needs to take place. And this is an interesting sequence of slides. This is the same area with an aerial photograph looking directly down at the area in Warm Springs. Here are all the avalanche paths. I don't have a map. In 1958, then look at it in 1966. This is just before the avalanche studies started to get done. And then look again in 1984. A tremendous difference in development. And now a lot of these places have been reinforced for not the old places, but the new construction tends to be reinforced for avalanche loads. But what this does do is produce a lot of use in the avalanche area. And these are low frequency avalanches. They don't run out every year. You have avalanches coming into these developed areas maybe once every 10 to 30 years, something like that. But you have a lot of people who are going to be walking through these areas, driving, walking their dogs, living in the area, and they're exposed because they're not in the reinforced buildings. Another example, and this is from Colorado, and this is the area where I first started to do work. It's in Vail, Colorado, and it's one of the early Colorado avalanche zoning cases. There was a lot of development because of the ski area. Vail ski area was just built in 1962, started to be built then, and property values were high. Development pressure near the ski area was high. Land values were high. Land prices were high, at least. And the runout zones were flat and buildable. And so there's a lot of building that took place. Here we have, on the left side, we have generalized mapping that was done at a smaller scale by the Colorado Geological Survey. I worked with them as a consultant in avalanche mapping back in the 1970s, and looking at some of these areas in a little bit of an enlargement. These are all original maps from the Colorado Geological Survey map files. Here we have an area where Vail required more detailed studies be done because of potential development. They had three areas. They had the red zone, the blue zone, and an area here known as an avalanche influence zone, where there may be avalanche problems, but you weren't allowed to develop the area unless you determined the severity of the problem or if there was a problem. But Vail was definitely a leader in the United States in terms of avalanche zoning. And it's changed, things have changed a lot over the years. Again, looking at the old map, this is Vail again. We have a 1969 map, which is just what I just was showing previously, looking at it in more detail here. And here is a detailed map using high detailed quadrangle maps, LiDAR maps, which show high detailed of the topography. And it's been remapped, shows the existing buildings and the extent of the avalanche path on this map. This is an indication of the way the maps can be revised based on the new technology that's available now. Silverton, Colorado is another example. I said I'm not going through all of these, but I'm going through several to be kind of a feel for what's going on. Here we have the San Juan County Avalanche Atlas for the 1970s, with the avalanche paths all outlined. Silverton here. Generalized map based upon the topography that's available from the U.S. Geological Survey, the old topographic map. Town of Silverton hired me to update this map in the year 2000. And so this map was based upon more detailed mapping and in more detailed methodology that has become available. Still, there's been, and Chris will talk about this a little later, the work that I did for Silverton in 2000 is really out of date because of the improvement of the technology and the mapping that's available now. The topographic map base is much better in places, and we have much improved avalanche dynamics models that can take into account the terrain in much more detail than we used to. 40 years ago, I did an extensive mapping project in Anchorage, Alaska, where we had, this is a typo, this should be 30, not 40, and 600 instead of 700, but minor problem. We spent a good part of the summer in Anchorage doing the field work and producing this report at a big project for Anchorage at the time. It's proved to be good information for citizens who believe the work, but it was never adopted in accordance with the 1986 policy memo. Again, recall that in Alaska, the free market reigns. Ophir, Colorado is another good example. Again, this is done by the University of Colorado originally, and where they mapped extensive areas in the San Juan Mountains in particular. Remapped in 1975 by the Colorado Geological Survey, and then remapped again in 2006 for a private landowner who had a detailed topographic map done. But we have a history of historic avalanching reaching the town limits 4 times between the turn of the last century and 1974. For example, the Elliott Hotel, old Elliott Hotel, was pushed off its foundation in 1918. And there, you can see it in this photograph as well. And they had large wet slides that reached the Elliott Hotel, pushed it off its foundation, and moved it into a new location. And the building was still okay. So I don't think there were any people in the hotel when it was hit, but you could occupy the hotel again after the avalanche occurred. Here's the Elliott Hotel on the detailed topographic map. And we had mapped it in the red zone. We didn't know when we did the mapping where the Elliott Hotel was there, but we had mapped to that point based on the topography, and the Elliott Hotel turned out to be in the red zone. So it was an appropriate mapping in this case. The town of Ophir, which is it's actually in San Miguel County, adopted avalanche maps that were done originally in the 1970s, and they didn't want to change them based upon the new mapping that was done in the year 2000 by the private landowner. because they adopted this one because it was a good enough map and they just didn't want to change. We'll talk about that too. There is a lot of resistance to changing these maps, even when there's good reason to change them. Mapping quality changes substantially from one area to another. This map up here is back in the Sun Valley area, in mapping that I had done back in 1978, I believe, on the old topographic maps using the old methodology. This is back before there was any computer availability to use, the advanced avalanche models. We just used slide rules in those days. More detailed mapping was done here by a local surveyor showing the red and blue zone. Here you have more detailed topography and more detailed topography yet in areas that just shows that where the topography is available, you have an opportunity to update the mapping. Hazard zones are defined differently in different locations. We talked before about the red zones and blue zones in the United States in terms of frequency and impact pressure. They're different in Canada. In Canada, the red zone, the blue zone, I should say, is it's if the return period is shorter and shorter, the blue zone, if the pressures are in excess of 10 kilopascals, the blue zones are, if in excess of 10, the blue zones become a red zone. Like, it's a different shape. And in Switzerland, it's even different. A 100-year avalanche requires the pressure to be less than 17. In Canada, less than 10. And our definitions, which are not nationwide, or require this much simpler definition here on the left. So it's good if we can update the maps based on the new modeling, the new mapping especially, and because we recognize that there are a lot of problems with the old maps. But the maps are really difficult to change. And that's because they kind of get set in concrete, because expensive land use changes in development may be based on the maps. And once people decide what the map says, then what they can do, they spend money, they buy property, they build buildings, and it doesn't seem fair to the people to change the maps. And so they're definitely difficult to change. I'd like to, at this point, turn over for the last few slides, to Chris, who'll talk to us about the new mapping technology that's available now. As I said, they're substantially improved, and they've only been available for the past few years. So if you want to do that, Chris.
Okay. Thanks, Art, and good job. So the whole time, the whole time Art and I have been working together, we've tried to do our best to combine his experience with my better handle on some of the newer technologies. So I've introduced Art to things like LiDAR and the ability to create different map products from LiDAR. The map on the left is an area of Taos Ski Valley where a house was hit. In fact, I'll move my cursor. I don't know if you can see the cursor, but this house right here was hit by an avalanche in 2019. And it was a tragic avalanche. It could have been a fatality, but it wasn't. It was very close. And Taos Ski Valley, since that time, has updated their avalanche maps because this particular event revealed, how the limitations of maps that were 25 years old. The map on the right is a slope angle map derived from LiDAR. This is 3 paths in Silverton. The lower one is known as the Idaho. The middle one is the Arcade path, a pretty famous path, both of them. And then the upper one is the Swansea path. Slopes are very important, as all avalanche practitioners know, and they come into play in land use planning. And I would say in kind of a slightly different way, partly because a lot of avalanche practitioners are working with frequent paths that have steep starting zones, 35 to 40 degrees. A lot of times in the land use planning world and engineering, we're worried about the 28 to 33 degree slopes that hardly ever release, but when they do, they can release quite big. In addition to LiDAR, we've got, of course, improved avalanche dynamics models. Mainly the Swiss models are the ones that we rely on. There are others. Here's a interesting site too, that the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory did some LiDAR of their own after a big avalanche in 2019 in this Avery Peak path, which is in Art's neighborhood. He has a cabin that has a front row seat to this avalanche path without being in it. The image on the left is snow depths, or calculated snow depths, LiDAR reflections, and probably during April of 2019, subtracted from the ground reflections, and that gives us a thickness of the deposits. The blue line shown there in the runout was an area I walked with Art with a handheld GPS, documenting where the vegetation damage stopped. So you can see that the deposits went, the yellow in there went a little bit beyond the clearly damaged vegetation. I mentioned the models earlier. The image on the left is a RAMS. There's 2 versions of RAMS. There's the RAMS version that does just the dense core of the avalanches, and then there's a newer version of RAMS that's still under development that also includes a powder avalanche component. It separates the core from the powder component. The map on the right is the Arcade, also known as the Rabbit Ears Path in Silverton. And the red and blue lines there are Art's map lines from 2000. So they aren't too bad. It looks pretty accurate, or the model, I should say, is an agreement. Or as Art and I would probably point out, both of them are probably wrong, but they're the best we can do. Art had mentioned this earlier. Avalanches are not perceived to be a high risk to a lot of people, partly because they're so rare. We don't get to see them very often, but when they do occur, the damage can be quite severe, including loss of life. So there's also risks that include costs of damages and legal expenses. Usually if there's damage, somebody wants somebody else to pay for it. And so we bring in, the legal profession into our field. Avalanche risks are just one of the risks that people face. We all drive cars. Our highway departments and the manufacturers of vehicles are continuously trying to reduce risk. We should be doing the same thing in the avalanche world. As Art implied or stated, we're probably not doing a great job of that for the reasons he mentioned. And that is, people do not want to change the zoning, especially if it takes their property and moves it from no hazard to a hazard. Art wrote a great article many years ago in the Avalanche Review. If anybody has it, I think he's lost it and would love to see a copy of it. But I think that the title was something about nature's timescale. And again, it's the same point to drive home that, a lot of avalanche practitioners work with, annual and 2-year avalanches and even multi-avalanches in a single season. And in the land use and engineering world, we're concerned about these long return periods that people have a harder time getting their arms around them. So where we're at today, many of the avalanche zoning maps go back to the 70s with Art gave several examples. Ophir, I'd say Vail has updated them. Taos Ski Valley recently updated all of their maps. Ketchum is still, I believe, mainly relying on the maps from the 70s, the more conservative of the two. We described some of the updated methods that are available. I didn't mention it, but in the LiDAR world, we can also look at these unclassified reflections, we call them, that are the non-ground reflections, and calculate whether we can calculate heights, whether it's a building or a tree canopy. And we're ending up using that quite a bit. It's a nice complement to studying our, the high quality aerial photos that we have today. So we're back to this thing too. If you own property and somebody wants to change the avalanche zoning, it can work in your favor or against it. And it really is problematic to change it for multiple reasons. The building codes apply risk categories for different design return periods for various hazards, including seismic, flood. These are just in recent years getting applied more in the avalanche world. And so instead of just saying, okay, if you're in the blue zone, you have to mitigate, we start looking at, oh, well, if you're going to build a hospital in the blue zone, it's very different than if you're going to build a single family residence. So different categories of land use really should be treated differently, even in the same hazard zone, based on risk. So yeah, that just kind of reiterates what we're saying here, and that risk-based approaches, and this is true, I think, in all of North America, the US, Canada, and in Europe, our field is moving to more of a risk-based approach for appropriate mitigation or lack thereof. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I think we can open it up to questions. And you should direct them to Art. I'm going to give him his chair back.
Thanks, Chris and Art. That was a fantastic presentation. We certainly have some questions, and we'll just start off right now. Nancy Elrod has a question, and how do you mentioned earlier in the presentations the difference between pressures, and how does that differ from design pressures?
The pressures used in zoning just put things in two broad risk categories. But when you come to, like, for example, the pressure against a flat wall that's normal to the flow of the direction would be substantially different than the pressure if you had a splitting wedge and the angle intercepted the avalanche at an angle of, say, 30 degrees or something like that. The pressure would be much less. So the design pressure depends on the design that you're contemplating. So and there will be uplift, there might be uplift pressures as well. So the 600 pound per square foot is not the design pressure. It simply defines a zone in which site-specific detailed study would have to be done.
Yeah, and I might add a little bit to that too. When we're looking at it from an engineering perspective, the flow depth really matters too. So, just a 1 foot, or a third of a meter flow depth at 600 PSF isn't nearly as destructive as a 3 meter flow height at the same pressure. So in the end, what really matters for designing structures is the combination of the pressures, the directions, and the flow heights.
And I might also add what the depositional loads would be when the snow rests against the building after, or against the structure after the avalanche occurs. There could be substantial depositional pressure too.
Excellent, thank you. So Don Sheriff has a question comment. He says it might be worth explaining the frequency scale of 1, 3, 10, 30, or 100 years. The question is why that system? So what's the relevancy of a logarithmic scale versus a linear scale?
Well, I think we're just being realistic in what and how you can specify the return period of the frequency. If I would like to think that we can do better than the nearest order of magnitude. We can do better than 30 to 100 to 1,000. And we can do a half order of magnitude, which would be like about 30 and about 300 to go sort of in between the two extremes. So what our frequency scale represents is crudely a half of an order of magnitude. And I believe when the Swiss came up with their frequency definitions, they were probably thinking of 30 years as the time scale of a generation. But I don't know if that was the case, but I always kind of assumed that. Originally, the Swiss had instead of the 30 and 300 year limits, they had 30 and 90 year limits. That was back when Hans Fruder wrote his Avalanche zoning plan in 1970. He never agreed with that, but I believe that's the Swiss changed from 3 generations to 10 generations for other time scale.
Great, thanks. Greg Johnson has a question. Art, what are your thoughts on the effects of explosive avalanche control with explosives on long return period events?
It's a risky business because you may create a smaller avalanche and avoid the major one, or you may trigger the big avalanche that you want to prevent. And when the legal profession gets involved, then the question becomes not what happened, but what happened and who was responsible for it. So that's my feeling on that one.
That's a perfect answer. Thanks. Sue Burak has a question. So in your 1989 report to Inyo County, the energy density isobars of 500 pounds per foot square drawn on the avalanche path map. The county building department has tried to institute guidelines for new structures to be built to withstand impact pressures of 400 pounds per foot square, per squared feet, there we go. What is the relationship between impact pressures and energy density isobars?
I'm surprised that question came up. Actually, impact pressure and energy density have exactly the same units. There's no difference.
Okay.
Energy density is the kinetic energy per unit of volume. And that has the same density as kilopascals.
Great. Let's see, Bruce Smith, he just wanted to mention that in Ketchum, they use the Wilson and Mears maps to determine if you're in a hazard zone. And then the city actually requires a recent site-specific study. So maybe it's changed a little from using the conservative of the two, the more conservative of the two. So I think we've run through those questions, but I've got one. Early on, Art, you mentioned kind of getting back to Don's question about return period scales. And you mentioned, the 1,000-year return period being, of course, one more related to climate. And that's, not, it has a different relevancy. So sort of what my question is, you know, with a non-stationary climate in the context of climate change now, do we need to rethink what that return period is? Like, is it, you know, that reflects climate? Is it 50 years? Is it 100? You know, to look at trends, we need 30. Is it 30? Or what are your thoughts on that?
That is a really good question that I've asked myself a lot of times. Yeah, I suppose you should change the return period definitions to change with climate change, but I don't know how it should be changed.
Right.
I don't know whether your 100-year events occur more often than once in 100 years or less often than they do occur randomly, but I don't know if they're more like if a 1% probability annual event is more like a 3%, or it's more like a 0.3. But I don't know, really. There is at least speculation among climatologists, I believe, that the climate change is, and I think this is probably substantiated by a lot of things that we've observed in the daily news. The major events seem to be happening more often than they used to. For example, the major floods along the Colorado Front Range in 2013 was an extreme event. Some extreme precipitation and atmospheric river-driven events in the West Coast, particularly of the United States, and Utah. The Utah mountains had a record snowfall in Alta just last year. But I don't really know how they're changing with respect to climate change. I suspect they are changing. It makes things more difficult for us.
Yeah. Thanks. It's very insightful. Don Sheriff has another question. With all the models that are available now for estimating runout, how does the alpha beta model hold up in your estimation?
The alpha and beta model is at best a first cut of it. And first of all, you need to the main thing is the alpha beta model is one-dimensional. It just gives a distance along a line. Basically, it's a distance along a single line. The new modeling that use the highly detailed topography we now have enables the direction to either side of the center line of the avalanche based on the topographic irregularities. So they're far superior in that they can give you an idea of what direction things are going to go, particularly when the velocities become reduced. So the alpha beta it's useful as a first cut, and I believe you should use as many tools in your toolbox as you can. The best tool, of course, is to observe nature's experiment in what nature has left on the ground for you. That's the best tool you can use.
And if I may add to the answer to Don's question, couple of things that the alpha beta models do not include are starting zone volume. It doesn't come into play. Ground roughness doesn't come into play. Aspect doesn't come into play. We all know these things are factors. And, Bruce Jameson did a good paper, and I think it's in his planning book about, like Art was saying, we use all the tools we have, and then we weight them according to our confidence in each one of them. And it is sort of like being a detective trying to come up with avalanche zones, where you've got a whole bunch of evidence and you sort it out and decide what's reliable, what's less reliable, and put it together in the best way you can.
Great, thanks. We have another question here from Tony Windsor. The question is, does adapting zoning to an area or governing body create liability issues to the adopting entity if there is an event?
Well, I have no legal expertise, so I can't really answer questions about liability probabilities.
Well, and I would say most municipalities and states have immunity from most things. And if their goal is to try to protect the public, that it's their duty to do that. And the question is, how do they go about it? And I suppose if they overstep, they could be subject to some kind of liability, but most of them would allow for instance, if we came in and said, hey, you're in the red zone, we recommend against building, and somebody objects, it's sort of like, a doctor's opinion. You can always get a second opinion. Hopefully the second opinion is well qualified. And Art, I think, indicated earlier, even like back in the 70s, when Norm Wilson mapped the Ketchum and Sun Valley areas, and so did Art, they weren't that different. So hopefully, different mappers come to pretty similar results, and then the differences can easily be explained by uncertainties in the process.
And the same thing is true in the Juneau area.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, it looks like we don't have any other questions in the Q&A, and we are at our hour. I think that's how much we had. So I just want to say thanks to both of you for presenting and sharing all of your knowledge and wisdom. It's been a pleasure. And so on behalf of the American Avalanche Association and all of the attendees, thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, and Claire, did you want to wrap up with anything, or are we good to go?
Nope, nothing else. That was great. Thank you, everyone, for coming out, and have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks.
Thanks a lot.